Okay. As we go through these 7 trumpets, one thing you'll notice is a repeated theme. And that is that it seems like everything comes in threes, or it comes in thirds. And that continues all the way through the 6th trumpet. And then it kind of, the information about the 7th trumpet is spread out just a little bit. But even as we get into that section, we continue to see that number 3 pop up. And what we know about the number 3, at least from the basic level of the creation gospel, is that it represents the 3rd day of creation, which is the first day that the trees and the green grass and the plants and all the pretty things would have appeared in the earth. So it's really the first sign of life, something that can grow and something that has seed in it. We can also look at the feasts, especially if we're going to look at Passover. Let's say that 3 of these branches represent 3 significant days of Passover. The first would be Passover itself, which is going to be between the evenings there when they slaughter the lamb on the 14th of Nisan, which would carry you into that evening. Then you have days of unleavened bread, and then you have the first fruits of the barley. So you really have 3 different elements that make up the first week, really, of the feast season. So we could almost say that's a third. If we're looking at 3 chagim, which is Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, when we say Passover, if you'll notice, especially in the Gospels, but not just in the Gospels, if you look in the book of Acts, when Jews are talking in the 1st century about Passover, or the days of unleavened bread, they tend to use the terms interchangeably, which can be a little confusing for us, because if we're looking for some sort of precision where we're trying to figure out, we work so hard to make days fit, into the categories, because we have so much to prove to people about scripture and how everything has to be nailed down completely. And sometimes it's giving you more of a principle and a pattern than trying to help you nail everything down completely, so that you can show other people how right you are about how you're interpreting when Yeshua died and when he resurrected and so forth. But we can look at those 3 feasts and say that at least in the 1st century, they would interchangeably use the days of unleavened bread with Passover as an expression. And that pretty much makes up a third, if we're looking at this menorah, in terms of that feast season. That's your Passover, including the days of unleavened bread. And then you're going to count toward the next foot festival, which is Shavuot. And then you've got this interim period like we're in right now. And then you run into the last third, really, of the feast season, which is going to include 3 distinct, we might even say 4 distinct feasts that are nevertheless related in theme. You can tie them all together. In fact, when we studied at level 1, we said, well, the theme of the spring feasts was separation. But we saw by the time we got to the 3rd day of creation that separation, the intention there was to lead to gathering. So we say he separates you in order to gather you to like kind and like mind. And we see that in its seed form, especially in the Passover season. We can look here at Shavuot, which really held elements of all the feasts when we start looking at it, because it set the calendar, it set the Moedim. So everything is growing out of this 1/3 of the foot festivals. There's only 3 foot festivals. There's Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And then as we go over here to the fall, we said, well, the main theme of the fall feast was coverings. There's still separation. You're still set apart in some way. There's still division, like with the Feast of Trumpets, that's a judgment day. Judgment decrees are sent out, but you tend not to see the effects of that in the natural realm until later, because some of those decrees involve things that will happen in the coming year, not that exact moment. Now, in terms of the resurrection, we're looking for it in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, right? So just like you would blink when you heard the shofar sound in the synagogue during the Feast of Trumpets, that's how fast you would be changed. And that's going to lead up to Yom Kippur. You're going to have 10 terrible days, and there's 10 days of testing that are implied even over in the Passover season. So they're chiastic in that way. And everything is going to be sealed up then, and then basically there's nothing new at Sukkot other than what you prepared for up to that point. And so you've got these coverings. You've got the covering of the clouds at Rosh Hashanah. You've got the covering of the blood, among several other things, on Yom Kippur. And then you've got the covering of Sukkot, when you go under the Sukkot and you dwell in the clouds of glory at Sukkot. So that's covering. So the first third, definitely separation, but prophesying and leading towards something. But the fall feasts, more of a covering. The assumption there is that the final separations will have taken place, and then you will be brought under the tabernacle. It will spread its tabernacle over you. And that's your final third. When we're looking at the three chagim, you can see how thirds make sense. But there's another context. If we want to look at the thirds, and let's see. Do I want to do a trumpet before we get off? Let's go ahead and look at the trumpet so that you can see this pattern of how many times the thirds crop up. And then we'll look at something that has, I think, a tremendous contextual link to these seven trumpets. Especially when we think of trumpets, they don't just herald a new month. They herald each of the Moedim, but they also accompany the king, right? It's a very royal aspect. And if we expect Yeshua to be seated or enthroned as a king, what instrument would we most likely expect to accompany that enthronement or that installment of him as the king over all the earth? Well, I would expect trumpets and shofars, since that's the pattern that we have so far. So even in the midst of this horrible judgment that we're reading about, at the very same time that it is bad news to those who will not repent, and if we got time, we'll look at that, the widow statement in Revelation, and go back to Isaiah, where the precedent is, and then make some connections there as to why that statement is made by Babylon that says, I will not sit as a widow. There's a specific context for that. And I think it's important, especially as you look at the Jewish viewpoint and how John brings that Jewish viewpoint and yet incorporates the nations into it. It really helps us understand how important Sukkot is. But anyway, the first trumpet is Revelation 8, and it said the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to sound them, and the first sounded, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. We'll remember the hail and the fire from the Passover in Egypt. And it says, and they were thrown to earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. So it's kind of a strange list there. We're good with the trees and the green grass because, you know, if you remember your kindergarten exercises on the little purple sheets. They would give you objects and say, which of these things go together, or which object in this group doesn't really fit with the others. And it was your job to circle that, and then you got a beautiful blue star on your paper, and it was wonderful. And that exercise is still good when we're reading scripture, by the way. Because if we see something that doesn't exactly add up, it's something we can set to the side and say, well, there's something that doesn't really fit with the others in this group, but all that tells me is I need to follow up. So I'm not telling you I have the answer to this, but I do want to point out a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees, and all the green grass was burned up. The oddity to me is it says a third of the earth, because earth doesn't burn. In fact, when the grass and the trees are all burned up, that's when the burning stops, because there's no more fuel for the fire. Unless where he says a third of the earth was burned up, that's implying something more specific than we're reading right there. At any rate, as we look at those first 3 days of creation, we realize that the trees and the grass were created on the third day, and they were created with a spirit of counsel. Well, in order to arrive at that third day, a couple of things had to precede it. The darkness and the light had to be separated out with the spirit of chokhmah, or wisdom. That's important. And then on the second day, the waters had to be divided from the waters. They had to do that with binah, or understanding. And then we arrive at the third day where, yes, there is still a separation concept, but the dry earth appears. And so that's what makes me wonder in this list where it seems like the earth doesn't really belong. Well, I mean, like with hail and fire and blood, again, it's like one of those doesn't really belong. I see the hail and the fire because I've seen those before together, but the blood in the Nile was a separate plague. We did see the hailstones on fire, but the blood was something separate. So now he's saying it's mixing all that together. Out of 10 plagues, now you're going to start to see not crossbreeding, but cross-contamination, or whatever we want to call it. It's like, with the elements, when you mix different elements, then different things come out, like H2O. You have to mix a hydrogen and an oxygen and a specific number of this and a specific number of that, and that makes water. H2O. But it's almost like these plagues almost have a similar quality, that how he mixes them together are producing a specific result. And the result can be similar to the way that it was in Egypt, but it could also be a little bit different. If he changes, he's starting with the same elements, but if you only had one hydrogen and one oxygen, then you wouldn't have water, right? You would have something else, even though the same elements were there to be mixed. And so there seem to be different mixtures coming out with these trumpets. So we've got a mixture of 3, hail, fire, and blood. And then we see the judgment is going to be that the hail and the blood, they all have the same effect as the fire that they're mixed with, because a third of the earth is burned, a third of the trees are burned, and a third of the green grass is burned. And we've looked before at how those things like trees and grass can represent people. Because remember, that's how the Torah, it was supposed to fall on the green grass, and the green grass was supposed to be thirsty for the Torah. And so this indicates to me, or at least it's hinting, that when it burns up this green grass, is that the green grass doesn't want to be green anymore. It doesn't want to listen. not listening, is important, because if we're told to Shema and Ha'azinu, and we don't Shema or Ha'azinu, then there's no way that we can be green grass. We can only be burned up grass, dry, no life. People are also compared to trees. So we're seeing these elements in threes. And then on page 56, we look at Isaiah 5, verses 20 through 24, and it gives us a hint as to what just went on here. When it says the green grass, a third of the green grass, a third of the trees, a third of the earth. Okay, Isaiah, I believe, is giving us a key to unlock that particular passage. And remember, what's going to come after this is called woes in English, like woe, woe, woe is me. And so they'll end up writing out and saying things like, you know, this many woes are past and this many woes are to come. So Isaiah doesn't just give us the imagery of the dry grass, he's also going to initiate the prophecy with the word woe. Not as in stop, but as in woe, this is a bad thing. So he says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. So if we're looking at these trumpets and bowls and so forth, and we see an angel announcing woes, we have a connection. Who is it woe to? To whom is it woe? It is woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And it just seems like here lately, everywhere I go, that seems to be the case. There's nowhere you can turn where people aren't calling evil good and good evil. And we're supposed to accept it because somehow people other than us have decided what is good and what is evil, but it has nothing to do with what Scripture says is good and evil. See, that is a lesson, and I believe I either read it or heard it in one of Rabbi Foreman's teachings. Maybe it was on Tisha B'Av, I'm not sure. But he pointed out that in the garden, when he put the human beings in the garden, what they had to agree to in order to remain in the garden is that what the Holy One called Tov, good, because he was Elohim. Remember, the first name there is Elohim, which means judge. He was the judge of what was good. He was the judge of what was very good. So by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what did they become? Judges, but crooked judges. Because instead of simply conforming to the plan, which is that, you know, whatever Elohim states is good, I say is good. And if he says this tree is not good for me, then I say it's not good for me. I agree with him that it would not be good for me to eat this tree, and woe to me if I eat of this tree and decide that I can be Elohim. And what does the passage say? She saw that it was good. She saw something different than what Elohim said she should be seeing in that tree. In that tree, when she looked at it, she should have seen, at least for her, it was evil. But instead, she became the judge and said, it's good. I pronounce it Tov, and therefore it's good for me. So she pronounced what was evil good. And she said what was good was evil. You hear the snake introduce this wedge, this doubt that said God's holding back on you? How many times, especially if you grew up in church, you heard people say, well, when I'm ready to settle down and everything, I'll commit myself to God, but I'm going to have a little fun first. Yeah. That tells you they know that what they're doing is evil, but in their eyes, it's a good thing to do. If you're just going to do evil, say I'm doing evil. And I choose evil. But I'm not saying that God said. No. It causes this twisting. So we can only call light what he calls light, and call darkness what he calls darkness. We can only say that which is tov is what he has established as tov. And we can't say that evil is tov. Now, we may have to live with evil, but it's not tov. And at the point we quit distinguishing between what is good and evil, then flip back to Revelation 8:6-7, and that's where you go. You go to a place where you're dried up and you're ready to be burned. You're like firewood. Basically, you become firewood. So you might have to live with laws and political sensitivities and workplace sensitivities and so forth that are completely contrary to what Elohim has already judged as tov. It doesn't mean that you compromise and you also say it is tov. You must never stop distinguishing, because Isaiah says when you quit distinguishing, woe to you, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Wow, that should evoke a memory of Passover. And after they leave Egypt, they go through the Sea of Reeds. They go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. And what happens? They run into water, but the water is bitter. And what does Moses throw into the water in order to make the water sweet? A tree, a stick. It's the same word, eitz. And he goes on and he says, woe, here's a second woe, to those who are wise, hacham, which is the spirit of wisdom, in their own eyes. What do we know about Eve when she looked in the fruit? She was wise in her own eyes. That's what she desired. Not what Elohim said was tov, but she wanted to be wise like him. And he says, it's not wise for you to be wise like me. You don't want to be a wise guy with God, right? He says, just stay in your lane here. But what happens? Woe to those who are wise, chacham, in their own eyes, and clever, which is binah, or understanding, in their own sight. Here's another woe. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine, and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe, and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. Okay, it's a continuation of the thing. It's describing a world that is completely backward. Whatever we have read in the Torah, when we see that it's been completely flipped, then we know we have entered into an era of woe, woe, woe. Do you see that in the text? Starting with verse 20, woe, woe, woe. It says, therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes stubble, and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot, and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the Torah of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. This is where I believe it might be referring to earth. When we look back at this trumpet and it says a third of the earth was burned up, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the natural realm. Well, here it is describing this tongue of fire that consumes stubble and dry grass that's going to collapse into the flame. What does that tell you? This grass really is no longer green. It was green at one point. But Isaiah is describing grass that has flipped. Human beings who have flipped, and they no longer know the difference between what Elohim has judged to be tov and what they in their own eyes have judged to be tov. And so it says something interesting. It says, so their root will become like rot. That seems to be the effect of the fire, not just upon the grass or the tree that you can see above ground. It's saying it's going to be rotten all the way down to the root, which is in the earth. So this is a supernatural fire. Typically, a wildfire is going to consume everything on top of the earth. But this goes deeper. This is a fire that's going to rot the root, which is where it came from anyway, right? The seed grows out of the root. The seed is rotten. The seed is completely corrupted. And so this tongue of fire, which we know is one of the descriptions of the Holy Spirit, just like the seals opening, why? So the Holy Spirit can go out for this examination. It's even going to go down to the root. And it says their blossom blow away as dust. Now I don't have the Hebrew in front of me on that. But typically, one of the words, Hebrew words used for blossom is like prachim, which is like a flower, but it can also refer to young, like young chicks. And so the root will become like rot, and their young, if that's the same Hebrew word I'm thinking it might be, are going to blow away as the dust. And it says why? They rejected the Torah. They despised the word. And this happens because they're wise in their own eyes. They're actually, it's not that, it's easy to say that the snake offered something very similar to Eve. He got really close to the word. But when you look at the end result, it was the opposite. And I think that's the end result of a lot of things, where the enemy comes in and he will actually start with the word itself. He might start with the Torah. And he very subtly builds a case to run parallel, and it's almost the same as. But in the long run, it's not going to be that close. Because even a slight deviation is the opposite. Just like Eve. Just seemed like a slight deviation. Oh, it's about wisdom. That's biblical, right? Mm-hmm. Where'd that get you? The exact opposite of the place she needed to be. She initiated something in which she and Adam became their own gods. They became their own Elohim, and they decided that they could judge what was tov, what was intrinsically tov or very tov, and it was no longer given to the one who created them. So again, when we reject the Torah of Adonai Tzevaot, when we reject the word of Adonai, the ultimate end, and he mentions here Chokhmah and Binah. All right, but it's a twisted, it's not the purity of the seven spirits of Adonai, which Chokhmah we attach to the first day of creation and Passover, and Binah we attach to the days of unleavened bread, the separation of the waters from the waters. See, if they truly had Chokhmah and Binah, then they would be able to separate tov from lo tov, good from evil, bitter from sweet. That's one thing I never figured out. And if you like to drink whiskey, that's fine. But it didn't take me but a couple of sips of whiskey to know this stuff is awful. I don't care how they're making over it in the movies and stuff and on billboards and acting like it's all sexy and stuff. And I'm like, this is the worst stuff I've ever tasted. And so apparently it's an acquired taste. If you liked bourbon the first time you ever tasted it, I'd like to know that, because I don't know how. It was just like smoking a cigarette. I get a migraine if I just walk through an area where people have been smoking. And I'm like, how long did you have to suck on that thing to think it was a good thing to do? At any rate, it presents itself as wisdom, or it presents itself as understanding, but it's the exact opposite. Now, over time, again, I think the Holy Spirit contends with you. I mean, not about bourbon and cigarettes, all right? But in terms of the Torah and the Word, the Holy Spirit, because you have Spirit inside of you, is going to contend with you and say, that's not proper. You know that's not right. In the inner parts of you, you know that's right. But over time, if you continually reject, what are you doing? You're drying out. Remember the dry grass? If you're not accepting the Torah like dew on thirsty grass, the grass dries up, the tree dries up. Remember, the description of Moses when he died was that his moisture had not diminished. He was still soaking up Torah. Now, how do you set a man like that on fire? You can't. How can you be set on fire and burned up if you are still anticipating, like a kid running out in a rainstorm, to stick her tongue out to catch those drops coming down, or going barefoot through the front yard when the dew's still on the grass just because you like to squish your toes around in it? If you still have that kind of heart for the Torah, then how are you going to be burned up? Because you're not being wise in your own eyes. You're studying the Torah and say, okay, this is what Elohim has judged Tov. This is what he has judged Lo Tov. And my viewpoint is the same, no matter where I'm living or what I'm doing. So as the tongue of fire consumes the stubble and the dry grass collapses, even the root like rot. So if this does not apply to you, if you have not rejected the Torah, if you have not rejected the word of the Holy One of Israel, then that's not you. It's not you. So this first angel, first trumpet, is describing something that I'm not saying it's irrelevant to you, but remember, it's dealing with the people who did not have the spirit of reverence. They did not have Yirat Adonai. And so without that spirit, what are they? Dry. Because it's the spirit that's in you that's striving to receive that word. And part of what's going on in the world today, and I think it's been stepped up, it feels like 1,000 times, just in the last decade or so. But in terms of people knowing how to distinguish between good and evil, it's lost. It's lost in school curricula. It's lost in politics. It's lost in especially colleges and universities. It's completely chaotic. And how does Satan want us to be? Chaotic, because we don't get anything done. If we don't know where we're going and we don't know our head from our tail, then all we do is go in circles, right? And that's good for him. Because it's about finding that road. And that's in the Torah portion this week, where Moses is recapping this thing about the spies, and he reminds them, guys, you found the road to go up, and you actually picked some fruit. And as you're reading the Hebrew words, and if we got time tonight, we'll look at it. If not, we'll do it tomorrow. But he's using the resurrection words like Allah. You went up. You ascended, basically, and were allowed to see into a different realm. And you saw how beautiful and how big the fruit was in that realm. It makes me wonder about whoever wrote the Jack and the Beanstalk story might have been onto something here. And then you came back down, you descended, it says, and you brought some of that fruit down. So you were actually able to go up there and experience it, and yet you came down and told us it was impossible. But it talks about the road, because the inquiry was like, okay, Moses, they need to go find the road. Like it's hard or something. Well, that's ridiculous. Why do they need to know which road to take? They've got a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire in front of them 24/7. You don't know which road to take? Talk about doing stupid things in panic. Just a few giants and they lost their minds. And they started calling good evil and evil good. So this is describing a people, and it's difficult because we tend to study more intensively than most of the people of faith we know. And we say, well, are they going to be judged for the whole Torah? I'm thinking, gee, I hope not. Because I'm hoping I don't get judged on the whole Torah. Because not one of us is walking it perfectly. But are we, what is our habit? What is our faith walk? Is it ever increasing faith? Or is it ever diminishing faith? We don't know that. We're not Elohim. And I think we get into trouble when we look at the person next to us and saying they're lo tov and I'm tov. My doctrine or my interpretation or my way of walking this out is tov and yours is lo tov. I say you leave that to the Holy One, because there again, you're risking calling good evil. They might be exactly where he wants them to be at that moment. And he might have their growth schedule on a different one than you. But what we can't do is, if we know the appointed times, we cannot ignore them. We simply cannot. We should not be in chaos about them. We should plan for them. If Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot are sneaking up on you, that's not a good sign. That's a sign of diminishing, not increasing. Because especially as we're reading through Revelation here, we realize how many themes here, it's all like a big thing of the Moedim. Everything revolves around that. So we have a people, because it specifically mentions Chokhmah and Bina, and then as we go back in Isaiah, and as we go back to Revelation, it's specifically naming things like grass and trees that deal with the third day of creation that we know is Itzah, the spirit of counsel. Well, if you don't know the difference between good and evil, darkness and light, you don't really have Chokhmah. You don't really have Bina. You can't separate the waters from the waters with understanding. So how in the world could you ever arrive at Eitzah and be a green tree? Chokhmah, Bina, Eitzah. You have to have them founded. They work together, but there is a chronological order of Chokhmah, Bina, Eitzah. So if the Chokhmah you're operating in really isn't Tov, it's not Elohim's version of Chokhmah, it's Chokhmah in your own eyes and Bina in your own eyes, then there's no way you're going to have the spirit of counsel, although that never stops us from trying to give it, right? You realize that the true test of the spirit of counsel is your ability to receive it. Why? Because it's like rain falling down. See, we all think we're counselors, but the first thing he wants to know is, can I counsel you? So if you're praying for the spirit of counsel, you have to understand that you're praying for the ability to receive it. And then in its season, it will start to bear fruit of counsel. The problem is, when you have the spirit of counsel, people tend to come to you to pick that fruit, and you don't really need to pick it yourself and throw it at them. I'm just saying. Okay, we got a second trumpet here in Revelation 8:8, and it says the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Okay, here are these thirds popping up again. If we think of the second day of creation and the division of the waters from the waters, then the lower waters become the sea. And it's describing this, and there is a separation because some of that sea life is dying, and even the ships, it's affecting the ships, which represents typically the commercial aspect of what's going on. Now, a great mountain burning with fire, we already have context for. That's the Torah. That's Mount Sinai. The mountain was on fire. And so what's happening with the second trumpet? It's one of those things where basically, like Isaiah is saying, the Torah is being thrown into the sea, and that which produces life in the righteous produces death. All right, it's kind of a parallel to the first trumpet, whereas you've got trees and grass that are going to be destroyed. This time it goes into the sea itself. And then the third trumpet, it says the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. These things would have appeared on the third day of creation, and they come with the third trumpet as part of the judgment. And it says the name of the star is called wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. Okay, so the ocean life has already been judged in a third, which you get from the second day of creation with the dividing of the waters from the waters. And then on the third day of creation, now you're starting to get the springs of waters because the dry earth had to appear, and rivers and so forth. And now those rivers, those sorts of waters, they are also being judged, and they were made bitter, right? And again, it's just a replay. If you go back to the Exodus, remember, he takes them out of Egypt. All right, and you get the plagues. A little summary here with the first trumpet, hail, fire, and blood, which we recall that from the Passover plagues. The second trumpet, remember, he takes them through the Sea of Reeds, and he divides water from water, like on the second day of creation. And then the next stop is where the bitter waters, the waters of Marah, and that's where Moses throws the tree or throws the stick into the water, and it's made sweet. Okay? But it was at that moment, and this is where a little bit of rabbinic commentary helps us, because it kind of records where people die in the wilderness. And because that was one of the first places that they complained about the bitter water, that's where some of them died. Or some of them didn't die immediately, but that's what brought forth their death in the wilderness. They still had 40 years to go. And it's just like with eating from the tree, on the day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. And you say, well, I'm still here. Well, no, you're not. You're not exactly where you were. And you will die once you eat from that tree. It's the same thing about the complaining. Some plagues kill you instantly, and some plagues kill you gradually. And this was the case here. It says many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. So what's going to test you? Torah is going to test you. Are you going to complain about it? Or with the spirit of counsel, the true spirit of counsel, will it make it sweet? Right? And it should also, we're still in the Passover season in terms of numbering. 1, 2, and 3 are all in the Passover season. So when it talks about the bitter waters, one thing we can think about is, associated with Passover, is the act of eating the bitter herbs. Okay, so just like it says in Exodus 15, they went 3 days into the wilderness. We're talking about the third trumpet, and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were very bitter. And they grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And the Lord showed him a tree. He threw it into the water. And we keep reading. The waters became sweet. There, he made for them a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight," not your sight, not what you say is tov, not what you say is nachon, not what you say is right, in his sight, "and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. So, with the third trumpet, we see people who have not taken this advice. They have not given ear to his commandments. They have not kept his statutes. And therefore, what does it say? Many men died from the waters. Just like they did in the wilderness to begin with. Why? Because they were not giving ear. And at that point, remember, they don't have this spectacular giving of the Torah. That's why I said it doesn't pay to try to figure out of your friends and family how hard they're going to be judged because they're not keeping Torah when Yeshua comes back. Remember, at this point, Israel has not received the Torah. They've not received all the details from Moses. They know a few things. They take some things out of Egypt with them. And had they simply acted in faith on the few things they took out of Egypt with them, number one, that God was in control of nature and the plagues. And if he was in control of nature and the plagues, then absolutely he could give them water. He could make the water sweet. They didn't even act on that much. So they weren't being judged here, but they are told, look, I'm going to give you statutes, commandments, and so forth. Listen to those things because you haven't even listened to what just happened to you. So he's really going to judge us according to what we understand. And that's why we have to be really careful that our understanding and our wisdom and our counsel is his understanding, wisdom, and counsel. Because if it's only in our own eyes, then we will get to the waters and we will say they are bitter when they are in fact sweet. Okay, we only got 10 minutes left. Let's go to, let me see if I can screen share. Make sure I don't have funny dog videos pulled up. There it is. Okay, this is reading from 2 Chronicles 23. And what I wanted to draw your attention to in this is the thirds. We see with the first, the second, and the third trumpets, and we're even going to see it in the fourth trumpet. The third of the sun, a third of the stars, and the woe, woe, woe. which we already read about woe, woe, woe in Isaiah. But I want you to see this correlation between these thirds and then an incident in which basically Israel has had a bad run. And so, or Judah has had a bad run here. And so they want to restore righteousness to the land. It says, now in the 7th year, Jehoiada strengthened himself and took captains of hundreds, Azariah the son of Yeraham, Ishmael the son of Yochanan, Azariah the son of Obed, Maaseiah the son of Adiah, and Elishaphat the son of Zichri, and they entered into a covenant with him. They went throughout Judah and gathered the Levites from all the cities of Judah and the heads of the fathers' households of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. Then all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God. And Jehoiada said to them, behold, the king's son shall reign. There's a little play on words for us. As the Lord has spoken concerning the sons of David, this is the thing you shall do. 1/3 of you, of the priests and Levites who come in on the Shabbat, the key there is Shabbat, which it also is in Revelation because everything's in sevens. And it even talks about the 7th year up there. This is the thing you shall do. 1/3 of you, of the priests and Levites who come in on the Shabbat, shall be gatekeepers. And 1/3 shall be at the king's house, and 1/3 at the gate of the foundation. And all the people shall be in the courts of the house of the Lord. That's significant. You got people in the courts of the house of the Lord, and then you also have priests and Levites divided into thirds on Shabbat. Some are gatekeepers, some of them are at the king's house, and some of them are at the gate of the foundation. Now that might be something for somebody to follow up on. It says, but let no one enter the house of the Lord except the priests and the ministering Levites. They may enter, for they are holy. This starts sounding a little bit like Revelation, where there are certain people who can come in and there are certain people who have to stay out. It says, let all the people keep the charge of the Lord. The Levites will surround the king, each man with his weapons in his hand, and whoever enters the house, let him be killed. Thus be with the king when he comes in and when he goes out. So the Levites and all Judah did according to all that Jehoiada, the priest, commanded. And each one of them took his men who were to come in on the Shabbat with those who were to go out on the Shabbat. For Jehoiada the priest did not dismiss any of the divisions. Then Jehoiada the priest gave to the captains of hundreds the spears and the large and small shields which had been King David's, which were in the house of God. He stationed all the people, each man with his weapon in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, by the altar and by the house around the king. Then they brought out the king's son and put the crown on him, and gave him the testimony, and made him king. Something else in Revelation, it talks about those who have kept the testimony. And Jehoiada and his sons anointed him and said, long live the king. All right, now enters Athaliah, and I did just a brief search on her, and it says she's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And we also have the Jezebel woman who pops up in the book of Revelation. And so basically she's been usurping the throne. It says, when Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came into the house of the Lord to the people. She looked, and behold, the king, and this would be the rightful king, was standing by his pillar at the entrance. And the captains and the trumpeters were beside the king. And the people of the land rejoiced and blew trumpets, the singers with their musical instruments leading the praise. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and said, treason, treason. Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of hundreds who were appointed over the army and said to them, bring her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her, put to death with the sword. For the priest said, let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord. So they seized her, and when she arrived at the entrance of the horse gate of the king's house, they put her to death there. So basically, they have ousted usurpers to the throne. They've installed the proper king from the house of Judah. And they have identified those who follow this offspring of Jezebel, and they put them to death, and then they put her to death with the sword, but not in the house of the Lord. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king, that they would be the Lord's people. And all the people went to the house of Baal, remember Jezebel and the priests of Baal, and tore it down, and they broke in pieces his altars and his images, and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Moreover, Jehoiada placed the offices of the house of the Lord under the authority of the Levitical priests, whom David had assigned over the house of the Lord to offer the burnt offerings of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and singing, according to the order of David. Burnt offerings there is a clue for us, as we've been talking about resurrection. He stationed the gatekeepers of the house of the Lord so that no one would enter who was in any way unclean. It says that in Revelation, that you cannot enter into the city if you are unclean. And then it has a whole list of things that it considers unclean. He took the captains of the hundreds, the nobles, the rulers of the people, and all the people of the land, and brought the king down from the house of the Lord, which is just totally cool. If we understand that what we have on earth is a mirror of that which is in heaven. And so this king coming down from the house of the Lord and came through the upper gate to the king's house. And they placed the king upon the royal throne. So all of the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had put Athaliah to death with the sword. All right, so it's a historical story, but in dividing into thirds, we can see a contrast. We can see that with these trumpets and these three woes of Isaiah, that it's judgment upon those who are basically part of the evil regime. They flipped everything. Evil's good, good's evil. Light's darkness, darkness is light. Bitter, sweet, sweet, bitter. They got everything flipped the other way. But in 2 Chronicles there, I think just in that little historical story, if we read it at a more spiritual level as prophecy, and we can see the intersections there, instead of having thirds of destruction or judgment, what you have is Levites and priests, which, there's the prophecy that I will take from among them as priests and Levites in that day, speaking of that world to come, that they are also divided into thirds, and they have holy jobs, which is basically to protect the reign of the king and to make sure that nothing unclean comes inside the house of God. And again, we can see several parallels with the book of Revelation, especially where John incorporates Jezebel as one of the more iconic figures from the Tanakh that people would remember, and the contest basically there with the priests of Baal. And if we look at the third trumpet, Revelation 8:10, it says the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. It fell on a third of the rivers and the springs of the waters, and the name of the star is wormwood. And a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. Stars are the offspring of Abraham. Okay? In fact, in our Torah portion, and we'll go over this tomorrow, in our Torah portion, they're reminded that they are the stars, that they have become as numerous as the stars, and that blessing has started to take effect. But there's also an understanding that the stars and the planets also represent principalities and powers in high places. I don't know that you would call them all demonic, because according to Jewish literature, some of them would be like good angels, like Michael and Gabriel and so forth. But they're called stars, or they're called, according to planets, because they have domains. And in this particular one, where it says a great star fell from heaven, this appears to be some entity that has had a place in heaven. Well, we read about that in Revelation 2, that, for the adversary, there's going to be no more place found for him. There's nowhere else he can go. He's run out of options. I don't know what he's been doing up there all this time, or around here. How far is heaven? Who knows? But he's run out of places. It says there's no place found for him anymore, and he's cast down to the earth. And he knows that his time is short, so he's basically ramping up the mischief. It feels like he's already here to me. We see this in the third trumpet too, that this great star, some entity falls from heaven burning like a torch, and he begins to pollute the creation of the third day. That which, see the fresh water that it's describing, the springs of waters, these would be the source of mikvah water. Right? And you wouldn't think that mikvah water could ever become unclean. But there's something going on with this process, where that what should be clean has been made not. It's been made bitter. And so with this casting down, we're looking at, it seems to be initiating for us a greater division, if we can call it that. If it wasn't clear with the first trumpet, if it wasn't clear with the second trumpet, then it's going to become much clearer with the third trumpet. And again, it says burning like a torch. And there's some things we could study about wormwood coming out of the prophets. And it has to do with authority issues, but it's kind of an involved study. But that's the thing we need to remember, is that for everything that's going on this earth, there's an equal number of things going on in a realm we can't see. And we can't see what we can't see. But Isaiah has given us the key. We can see things going on in the natural realm that is telling us there are great wars going on with the principalities and powers. And so as goes that realm, then so is going to go the realm we live in. And it's probably a good thing we can't see into that realm at this point to see what's going on. Because if it's so bad right now, or at least in my opinion, I mean, where do you go to get away from evil? Nowhere. There's nowhere you can go unless you just go by a little island somewhere where you never run into people. But everywhere that you go that there are people, there is wickedness, and the world has turned upside down. Our protection against that is to continue to study the difference between what is good, what is evil, what is light, what is darkness, what is bitter, what is sweet, without becoming bitter ourselves. That's the lesson of the third trumpet. Don't become bitter yourself. Just because it's poisoning the water for everyone else, don't become bitter yourself. You have to know what sweet is. And no matter how bitter this world is we live in, if we remain immersed in the Word, it's going to sweeten even the bitterness that we have to endure. Because every one of us right now, if we were to take a poll, and if on my Brady Bunch view right here, if I went through each one of these squares and said, tell me right now, what is the bitterness of your life? Every one of you could name something. I could name something. But imagine having this bitterness of our lives without Yeshua and without his word. How much worse would it be? In fact, the temptation would be just to simply conform to the bitterness. But he's our only hope. His testimony. Remember what it said in Chronicles? They gave him the testimony. Why? Because they had held it safe through the regime of evil. They had held it safe, the testimony safe, through the rule of the descendants of Ahab and Jezebel. They had held it safe even though the altars of Baal were all over Judah. In spite of that, they held the testimony safe, and they knew what was good, and they knew what was evil, and they knew what was light, and they knew what was darkness. Because the Torah is a light. The commandment is a lamp. And you have to stay rooted and grounded in the word, even through the bitter times, so that you don't dry up, so that the grass doesn't turn brown at the end of the summer. Remember the trees in that city above, they just stay green all the time. And so on the outside, it might look like we've gone brown because of circumstances, but on the inside, what does it say? We can be full of sap and very green. We can be like Moses. We can say, keep that moisture inside of me. Don't let Torah evaporate out of me. Please don't let it evaporate. Let me hold it dear. Don't ever let me call that which is sweet bitter. Because these woes, they are kind of frightening to read about. But when we go back to Isaiah, and we realize the woe is for those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. That's not me. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight, who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink. Well, okay, we could do a self-check right there and say, do I have alcohol imbalance in my life? I think we've talked about this at, going out to Sukkot. We need to be careful that our freedom doesn't become a stumbling block. And that's just it needs to be iconic of everything, not just wine, but in every area of our life. Are we being balanced? But we don't want to be heroes in drinking wine, right? We don't want people joking about how much we drink, if that makes sense. And valiant men in mixing strong drink. Well, if you're a bartender, I guess you need all the recipes, but if you're not, I don't know that you need to have the recipe of every mixed drink in your head. That seems like an awful waste of space to me. Who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of those of ones who are in the right. Right? That's a woe. Right there. These are the sorts of things that we can examine ourselves for in terms of our dryness or our moisture. Because see, the great thing is, had they not complained about the water, you realize they would have come to the palms, the 70 date palms of Elim, ready for Sukkot. You know, it's Sukkot that you wave the palm branches, and 70 is the number of the nations. And imagine the good that would be represented by those 70 date palms of Elim to Sukkot of the nations, but instead they complain because the water's bitter. So we'll wrap this up for right now, right here. I kind of thought we would get through at least the fourth trumpet. But that helps us, I think, taking time to stop and look at that passage and find those links to, there's been one on the throne who was a usurper to the throne. Possibly what it's describing in this third trumpet. There's another place where I think it definitely is, where it says, you know, there was no more place found for him. It's because he has no business being there. He's been allowed to be there. And this great star that falls from heaven, burning like a torch, he was occupying a place that was not his. So as we read through the passage out of Chronicles, we see that somebody has been occupying the throne and that did not belong to that person. And so when Yeshua comes, what will happen? The improper, the usurper to the throne will be thrown down. And there will be people appointed in thirds, basically to form the guard for that king in the house of God. And then it says all the people will be in the courts. Isn't that not just cool? I thought it was.